Sensorimotor integration includes diverse processes through which sensory signals influence the activity of the motor control systems. The reflex is a simple example of sensorimotor integration, where sensory signals are communicated to motor neurons without any requirement for communication with the brain. A more complex example of sensorimotor integration is responding to a command. This requires sensory signals from the auditory system to influence activity of the corticomotor circuits, which in turn drive a behavioral response.
So we're going to talk about the neural basis of speech and language to get some sense of why things like this happen. We'll see that speech and language depend on regions of the temporal association cortex near the auditory cortex that are important for comprehending language. And we'll see that speech and language depend on regions of the frontal association cortex near the motor cortical areas that control the mouth and tongue and throat. And we'll see that speech and language also depend on the pathways that connect those regions. Language really is a prime example of what we call sensorimotor integration. It's really a fully integrated function that involves auditory cortex, motor cortex, and regions in between integrated together. So this idea of sensorimotor integration is not really that different in principle from the idea of sensorimotor transformation, which we talked about in our vestibular lecture. In that case, there were synaptic chains linking sensation to a movement. In the case of the vestibulo-ocular reflex or the vestibulo-colic reflex, vestibular input ultimately led to changes in muscle activation. In something as complex as language, though, it's not clear that what's happening can really be understood as something as simple as a transformation through a chain of synapses. So here we tend to use this albeit more vague idea of sensorimotor integration to describe what seems to be happening in processes like this. But it's still kind of a thorny idea. For years, I heard the term sensorimotor integration, and I was like, I don't quite understand exactly what that means. But then as I progressed in my career, I realized that the field itself doesn't really understand exactly what it means. It really is sort of a vague idea, but it does seem to capture some of what's going on here.
In introductory classes, you learned about many examples of sensorimotor integration, which is an umbrella term that includes a huge variety of pathways. Here are two examples. The retinal ganglion cells send visual signals to the superior colliculus, which in turn projects to the brainstem motor control centers that influence the control of eye position and can direct the eyes towards a point in space. Similarly, the vestibular afferent cells send signals about head position to the vestibular nuclei, which in turn project to the spinal cord motor control circuits that influence posture and can help to maintain balance during everyday tasks.
Detailed knowledge of sensorimotor integration plays an important role in clinical neuroscience. Reflexes, like when the pupil constricts in response to a bright light, are very basic examples of sensorimotor integration. Importantly, reflex testing can be combined with knowledge of neural circuits to test for neural injuries, even if a patient cannot communicate or if that patient is unconscious. For example, the vestibulo-ocular reflex, which is abbreviated VOR, can be used to test function of the brainstem. Recall that the VOR involves sensory signals about head position that are transmitted to the vestibular nuclei in the brainstem. The vestibular nuclei then transmit signals to the cranial nerve nuclei in the brainstem, which in turn coordinate movement of the eyes. Even if a patient cannot communicate, you could test brainstem function by turning the head from side to side and then looking for compensatory eye movements. A lack of eye movement would suggest brainstem damage. It is important to check for this following brain injury because damage to the brainstem can potentially disrupt the circuits that regulate breathing.
Now that you've had some review of sensorimotor integration, let's see if you can follow along with this example of conduction aphasia. In order to orient you, I'm going to start off here with this dotted line, which is illustrating the central sulcus. Anterior to that, we would have the primary motor cortex, which I am abbreviating M1. Then we can also see here the lateral fissure that's separating the frontal and parietal lobes above from the temporal lobe below, and the primary auditory cortex, which I'm abbreviating A1. Now, if we were to look posterior to the primary auditory cortex, that's where we would find Wernicke's area, which I'm simply going to abbreviate with a W. This is part of the secondary auditory areas of the cortex, which is required for language comprehension. Similarly, if we look in the frontal lobe anterior to the primary motor cortex, this is where we would find Broca's area, which I'll abbreviate with a B. This is a motor region that is required for the production of speech. And importantly, there is communication between Wernicke's area and Broca's area. meaning that there is communication between those regions required for the comprehension of speech and those regions required for the production of speech. Particular parietal lobe lesions can affect this white matter tract that allows Wernicke's area to communicate with Broca's area. And this produces a very characteristic set of symptoms called a conduction aphasia. Comprehension remains because Wernicke's area is intact, and the ability to produce words remains because Broca's area is intact. But there are difficulties with integrating these two processes. So for example, a person would have difficulty with repeating a word because while they have comprehended it, that region is not able to communicate with the region that would be required for reproducing that word.